The burning air yields nothing. Too many seasons without rain have turned the ground to dust. Like so much of the rest of the Horn of Africa, the lands of the Turkana are in the grip of drought. They are nomadic pastoralists who depend on the rain to provide grazing for their animals. Now they come seeking relief. This emergency feeding centre is providing rations for malnourished children near the town of Kaikor. The animals on which these people depended for a living have died. A tribe which is among the most resilient and self-sufficient in the world is reduced to queuing for food. All morning people have been continuing to arrive as news spreads around here that food and medical help is available. Now, if you remember that this is just one village out of hundreds across this region, you get a sense of the magnitude of this drought. How many droughts have you seen in your life?
10.
10 droughts.
10 droughts.
Is this as bad as the other ones, or is it worse?
He's saying this is worst of all.
There are still food shortages despite the donation of a huge amount of international aid. What are the problems with the children here?
Malnutrition.
That's the main problem.
Yeah, malnutrition.
I've set out to discover why there's no food security in a country that's received billions in international aid over decades. Drought caused by climate change is certainly a major problem. And the fact that Kenya hosts more than 500,000 starving refugees from Somalia. But Kenya's crisis has other, murkier roots.
God makes droughts, men make famines. And we stole from the Turkana. We stole from ourselves, and we are starving as a result.
Across East Africa, the brunt of the food crisis is being borne by pastoralist communities like these. There have been some government-sponsored irrigation projects, but the overwhelming sense is of neglect. The infrastructure here is meagre and much of it crumbling. Joseph Lasulu sells water to his fellow villagers that he draws from this hole in the bed of a dried-out river.
We
feel rejected by the government. I don't understand why they don't help, why they don't provide any assistance. The funds, but none of it trickles down here.
The Kenyan government's official line is to blame the drought for this crisis. The international community and the Kenyan government have now mounted a massive relief operation. A record £72 million was donated in Britain to help feed the starving. What's unfolding here isn't simply the consequence of drought. Kenya's food crisis is, above all, a crisis of governance. You simply can't separate the imagery of hunger from the corruption and neglect that has characterized the rule of Kenya's political elite. It's all grimly familiar to the man who was once Kenya's anti-corruption chief and who now helps the UK government monitor how its aid is spent. How much of an impact did corruption have on the hunger crisis in parts of this country now?
The drought that we have in Kenya is a governance drought. It's a corruption drought. It's what's turned a drought into a famine.
3 years ago, Kenya knew it was facing a severe drought. Yet it's emerged officials sold much of the country's grain reserve to middlemen at subsidised prices. The middlemen then sold the grain onto the local market at exorbitant rates. Who were these people?
Well-connected people. People who are connected to senior politicians.
But that's people profiteering out of famine.
Absolutely. It's the coldest most merciless kind of corruption. Because like this time, people are dying now.
Yet in Nairobi, headquarters of the government and the courts, the authors of the scandal have gone, like so many before them. An estimated 1/3 of the country's budget may vanish to corruption every year. Food aid, in this case from Saudi Arabia, is being used to make up the shortfall in Kenya's supplies. When I met the minister responsible for the relief effort, she was remarkably candid about what corruption has done to her country.
I think it has ruined us, because if a son sees his father stealing and he gets away with it, he thinks it's the way to do things. Until we prosecute and say no to impunity, then there remains a problem.
And it doesn't matter how high up the chain that goes.
In fact, the higher you reach, the better the message will be received better. Because occasionally, and what the cry of the Kenyans has been, is that the courts target the small fish as opposed to the big fish. So if we started targeting the big fish, I think the message would be loud and clear.
Some of your government colleagues might be a bit nervous hearing you say that. They mightn't be too happy with you.
Well, if you've been corrupt, you don't have to be happy.
There are those in the government who I believe it when they say that. But they're not the ones who wield the vital levers of power in the government. You have to keep in mind this is a coalition government. We don't have an opposition in Kenya, really. It's a mixture of everyone. So
with a fair sprinkling of crooks in high places.
Absolutely, yeah. With a fair sprinkling of very hardened thieves in high places.
International donors increasingly seek to deal with the dilemma of corruption by bypassing the state. Being used to try and stimulate local markets, moving people from pastoralism to the cash economy. 21st century technology is harnessed in the remotest of places. These women run small shops with grants they receive from Oxfam, money that goes directly from donors in Britain to local people. They queue with their smart cards, but instead of a PIN to get their cash, they give a thumbprint. Lois Epem supports 6 children from a small shop.
All my animals died and I was forced to beg for food. But this opportunity has allowed me to open up a business. Now I can afford to feed my family.
A way of life dependent on regular rain to provide grazing is threatened, perhaps terminally. Here on the shores of Lake Turkana, an EU scheme is encouraging pastoralists to turn to fishing to eke out a living. Lukui Noyopolon lost a huge flock of animals, among them 200 goats. For him, the government has always been far away.
There is a small amount of aid from the government, but I haven't had any help. Some get the food, others live without.
It says much about the scale of the crisis facing the pastoralists of Turkana, that a people who used not even eat fish, whose whole sense of themselves was built around roaming the land with their livestock, should now find themselves here as part of a community of fishermen. The big issue isn't that many more thousands will have to change their way. It's whether they can survive at all in this part of Africa. Aid that goes directly to communities can change lives, but the forces ranged against these people are daunting. Climate change, rising food prices, corruption.
How important is it to end the culture of impunity that has allowed people at the very top to get away with looting this country?
You're already in serious trouble.
Yeah, if we don't solve that, I can see this crisis year in, year out for the next 20 years, I don't know.
The world can pour any amount of